Dan, how do I pronounce your last name?
It is pronounced Bublitz.
Bublitz. Okay.
Yep. Bublitz.
All right, everyone. So I'm here with Dan Bublitz. He's coming out of St. Paul, Minnesota. He's a stand-up comedian. He's got a podcast. He's got lots of great projects, you guys. How's it going, Dan?
It's good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Bublitz Entertainment is just, it's like I said, it's my production company. I do produce comedy shows and I book rooms throughout the Midwest. Pre-pandemic I did. And then I do like fundraisers and things like that. So it's just basically my entertainment label. It's Bublitz Entertainment because Blitz is, my last name is Bublitz. So it was a way to incorporate my name without actually incorporating my full, my name into the production company. So whenever I produce shows, because I also do stuff like online and stuff, virtual shows and stuff. So whenever I produce, I just throw my Bublitz Entertainment, company logo on there, and then also use that for my stand-up comedy business as well. So anytime I get booked for comedy, it just goes through my business, goes through my company.
Very nice. So it all kind of rotates and ends up back in Bublitz Entertainment. You can go ahead and get within that. That's awesome. So how long have you had Bublitz Entertainment now? You said pre-pandemic, but how long has it been that you had Bublitz Entertainment? Over the years, I've had various little production companies that I've did when I was producing comedy shows and things like that. But I think when I moved back to the Midwest about 5 years ago, I just converted it to the Bublitz Entertainment. So probably about 5 years. Nice. And where are you exactly?
I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota, but I've lived all over the country. I used to live in San Diego. I born and raised in South Dakota, lived in South Dakota for a while after I moved back from California. So
with regards to the talent behind your company, is it just you? Do you have a lot of local talent? Do you connect with a lot of people via the web?
Well, yeah, so I'm connected with a lot of people because I also did run 3 comedy festivals over the years. I've been involved in multiple comedy festivals, and right now I'm only working with one, which is Snow Jam Comedy Festival. So I met a lot of comics, and because I do producing, I have a pretty good network of comics. And so while primarily if the gig is fitting and I can do it, then yes, I'm the comedian. But when I need to book other people, I have a pretty strong network of comics that I can pull from to do, whatever shows that might be. Because I've also been focusing more on family-friendly comedy. I'm kind of more of a clean comedian, just because I know that being clean, there's more money in it because you can do corporate gigs and things like that.
Right.
I try to do so.
Absolutely. Well, you got to go where the money is sometimes, almost all the time, right?
Right.
Absolutely. Well, hey, it's quite phenomenal that you're able to, again, bring everything back. If you need to work on your craft yourself, you can go ahead and perform, and it's behind Bublitz Entertainment. If you want to help gain some exposure for anybody, Bublitz Entertainment.
Yeah, absolutely. You can check out the website, blitzentertainment.com. Has all the info there. If you're in the St. Paul area and you need a fundraiser, I do fundraisers too, which is a great way to, it's a great way to help an organization and be able to put on a good comedy show. So.
Very nice. Post-pandemic, what's the plan? Do we have a set plan? Do we have a visionary mood board that we're sort of going about, or are you just trying to stay afloat right now?
Right now, I'm just kind of working on getting my own bookings, just getting back on my feet, as far as, before the pandemic, I had a lot of stuff booked. My plan was that I was going to, by the end of 2020, I was going to be a full-time comic and producer. And then that happened and that put the kibosh on it. So,
man, talk about a momentum tumbler, just throwing all the blocks down, but it's rebuilding the momentum.
It really is. Yeah. So now that things are starting to open up, people are getting vaccinated, things like that. Now I'm just working on getting myself booked and kind of get back up there. I use I produce a virtual show right now that I've been doing monthly with Bublitz Entertainment called Virtually Clean Comedy.
and then I've been scouting for some venues around the Twin Cities to do some other stuff as well. But the main focus is just getting back into comedy, my own, getting
Can we
my own.
talk a little bit about the clean comedy side, or interrupt you, Dan?
No, absolutely.
Can we talk a little bit about the clean comedy? Were you always a clean comic, or did you have to bring it back, reel it back? Was this a decision you made along your career?
So it wasn't really a decision I made consciously. It just kind of worked out that way. Because what happened is when I lived in San Diego, like I never meant to be a clean comedian, or I just, my philosophy was I just wanted to be funny and just be a comedian, like when I started doing comedy, I didn't realize there was like differences, where you could be a blue comic or, a clean comic or, one-liner storyteller, none of that stuff. I was just like, I gotta go tell jokes or whatever. So obviously starting out, most comics, when they start out, you're very immature with your jokes and things like that. So no, I was not always a clean comic. Definitely had some stupid jokes that were probably pretty dirty, and some jokes that were probably offensive to people. Now looking back, it's like some of the material I probably did when I started, I'm like, oh, can't believe I thought that was funny.
You need the freedom to fail, though, and that's the place to do it. That's the work board. That's the place where you do it. So
yeah, absolutely. But then what happened was I moved to San Diego, and there was a production company out there. They produced a lot of live shows, but they did a lot of shows in like coffee houses and restaurants, and so they were very conscious of who might be in there. So they were geared towards family friendly comedy, and so they did a good job at mentoring comics and helping them. Their philosophy was to be clean and clever, and they like I said, they did a lot of mentoring with a lot of comics, and I just working with them, I just started writing clean. They taught me that I didn't need to use profanity as a punchline and things like that. So then as I progressed in my comedy career, I just started writing without that, and then now, last October, I filmed a dry bar comedy special, and if people that are familiar with dry bar comedy, they specialize in clean comedy. They put out, safe for work content, family friendly content online, and they're pretty well known for that. So I just filmed one of those. So the more I'm doing, I keep getting put in situations where I'm just doing more and more clean. So I'm getting known as a clean comic.
Learning as you're doing, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like you were just kind of learning it as you were doing it, sort of tailoring your work towards the audience you were working with. Yes, you made the appropriate changes, and here you are. You're a cleaner, better comedian, and just a better, artist in general from learning from the crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, a lot of it's attributed to the mentorship through. I mean, they were Brouhaha at one time. Now they're Comedy Heights. I mean, they're still, in San Diego, and they still put on shows, and they're still mentoring comics to try to work clean. But that's, after that just kind of got me writing clean. And then, through comedy, you realize that, if you want to do corporate comedy and, things like that, you have to be clean. Like you have to have clean material. And that's something when I moved back to the Midwest, I knew I was going to be doing. So I just kept focusing on clean comedy. And then, now I'm more known as a clean comic, but it's not one of them things that like I broadcast, I'm not like, I'm a clean comic. It just kind of happened, but now I'm embracing it because it's like, whatever.
What's that field like? Is there more opportunity for jobs because everybody's out there trying to be the dirtiest, wildest comic, or is there equally as much as
there's equally as much competition? I mean, because you have comics that you see on TV that are household names or whatever. When they tour, they're doing theaters now, but then you have comics that just work in comedy clubs, and they're very well known through kind of that circuit. But then there's comics that you've never heard of because they're not going to comedy clubs, and they're not household names because all they focus on is corporate comedy. So that's their primary business. They basically don't perform publicly at all. They just write their material, and maybe they'll go to an open mic or whatever to work out a joke, but they're just working for, doing corporate comedy. So there's quite a bit of competition there can be. And it really depends on what area, if you're in an area where there's a lot of companies that have events where they want to bring in an entertainer, things like that, there's definitely going to be more competition. And then even with that, sometimes these bigger companies have bigger budgets and they can afford to bring in a celebrity comic or a household name too. So you're competing with other comics that just specialize in corporate comedy. And then on top of that, you're still competing with all the household names because there's a chance that they could still get the gig. They could get the gig.
What's really beautiful and awesome about comedy, though, is no matter if you have this high celebrity status or low status, comedy is comedy. And if you can control a room and read a room and make them laugh, I'm sure you'll get a lot of laughs. And obviously, celebrity status can go a certain way, but you're only as good as your last show. And I'm sure you know better
absolutely.
than I with regards to that.
Absolutely. And that is so true. You're only as good as your last show. And, it's the only thing about being a celebrity comic being a celebrity doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good comic. It just means you're going to be able to fill a room. That's essentially what it is. It doesn't, having that status doesn't make a comic any better than somebody you've never heard of. It just means that they're going to get booked because they have the drawability and they can fill a club. And because some of the funniest comics that I've seen are comics nobody's ever heard of because they just work the road day in and day out. They're doing these lousy one-nighters or these B/C list clubs, and they're just out grinding every day of their lives.
Everyday grinders, weekend warriors.
Yep, and they're just out there doing it. And they're some of the best comics because they've been in like every situation possible.
How many Christmases have you had to work, or how many holidays rather have you worked? New Year's
is a big one for comedy. New Year's is typically that because it's a big day for comedy shows typically. Other holidays, not as much. Comedy kind of, a lot of times you might work that weekend. So you might not be working on the holiday, but like you might get booked that weekend. And, pretty much if, you might have to be out of town for the holiday, but you're probably not working. But New Year's is big comedy day. But then also there's a lot more money involved in it too, because with New Year's shows, they usually try to do some fancy dinner and, with the show and this and that. So they're upselling a lot of what it is. And so there's more potential to make more money as an entertainer anyway. So it's like, it's a good day to be working. It's basically like, it'd be the equivalent of getting holiday pay at a regular job, where you're getting triple time. It's kind of the same scenario. You're going to make more money on those holidays.
There's just always so much being spread out throughout that time.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty insane when you see these high status comedians, they'll get taken out of a room that might have a lot of regard and respect for them, and you put them into an environment sort of like Bill Burr was in for the Grammys. And, a lot of people didn't know how to take the comedy for just comedy, right? They sort of took it for face matter. And sometimes that's the problem, right? You have to be able to read a room, but at the same time, it's such a hard job for a comedian because that's your job. That's the best part about it. When you can say the most absurd thing, the thing everybody's sort of thinking but doesn't want to say, things of that nature.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And sometimes, doing that, it just doesn't, it doesn't work out because the audience, even though they're thinking it and they've thought about it, they don't want to admit it, because it is, you can definitely as a comic get put into these, awkward, weird situations, but I don't know. Reading the room is definitely part of it, but there's some situations where comedy just isn't, people don't go to the Grammys to see comedy. You know what I mean? Like they're expecting, depending on the host, they're going to expect it to be funny, but then I think they have different expectations as to what comedy is or what stand-up is. When people go to a comedy club to see a stand-up comedy show, 9 times out of 10, I would say they know what they're getting into. They made the choice to pay for these tickets to go see a comedy show because they want to laugh and they want the comedian to say that absurd thing that they're thinking and they want to have a good time. But when you get in these other situations, like I said, like with the Grammys, people aren't there for that. You know, they want to get their awards and see these musical performances and things like that. And the comedy is just kind of a thing that happens. A lot of times, especially celebrities, and maybe it's more so celebrities, don't want to admit and own up to the fact that at the end of the day, they're people. And they're not any better than anybody else, even though they may act and feel like it, you know, so they just don't want to admit it. So having stuff like that thrown in their faces, you know, that reminder that, oh, hey, we are real people, kind of puts them off, and then they don't want to laugh.
Absolutely. It's so hard to separate the person from the persona.
Oh, absolutely. That's a very good way to put it.
How about with regards to you when going up on stage? Do you have a persona? Are you Dan? Are you talking about everyday stuff? You know, what's that like? Are you
I'm just an exaggeration of how I am in real life. I mean, that's a lot of my material are observations and then experiences from my own life. Like, I'm not a jokey joke comic necessarily. I mean, I do write some jokey jokes, you know, like one-liners and stuff, and I've been doing more of that now, but it's more to sprinkle in with my other material, because I'm more of a storyteller. You know, I do stories about my life, and you know, I talk about like my family, you know, because I come from, you know, I have a weird upbringing. I was pretty much raised by my dad, single father. And he's a character in himself because he's, you know, typical Midwest redneck type of guy. But he used to be, you know, I have a joke about it where I say, you know, my dad used to be a marijuana toting hippie. Now he's a gun toting redneck. And, you know, and it's true. Like it was, you know, so I talk about things like that because that makes for an interesting upbringing, you know.
Absolutely.
I myself have had some interesting relationships as an adult. And so that, you know, kind of gets mixed in there. So like I said, a lot of what my material is just kind of my experiences and observations of, you know, what's happened to me, and some self-deprecating humor, things like that. Because I feel like doing that, I like to play it safe that way, where, you know, especially now we're getting to a point where, you know, you want to try to punch up, obviously. I mean, nobody wants to go to a comedy show. Like, there's a line where, you know, some people are a little too sensitive, but at the same time, as a performer and a comedian, you have to be sensitive to what your audience wants. And nobody wants to go to a comedy show and be made fun of in a mean way. You know, like if they're getting kind of messed with a little bit and fun, they're kind of into that. But when you get into where you're just being mean and offensive or whatever, people don't want that. They want to go and have a good time. And so I try to be very conscious with that with my material. And one of the safe ways with that is if I'm talking about myself, if I'm the guy I'm making fun of, sometimes there's been instances where they might feel bad for me, you know, and instead of getting a laugh, I get like, oh, you know, like they feel bad or whatever. But I know I'm not going to have to worry about offending anybody, because if somebody's getting offended about me making fun of myself, they've got some issues beyond that, you know.
And sometimes they really do take it for the entire performance. That means they're encapsulated by it, right? Because at the end of the day, this is material that you're prepared to deliver for them to have a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a lot of like I said, what my material typically is. Sometimes I do some observational stuff, and, you know, like I said, I've been doing comedy for almost 11 years now, and I've definitely adjusted my material in the sense where, Like I don't do a lot of political humor, and that's because, primarily I do a lot of stuff in the Midwest. I see a lot of comedy in the Midwest, and I see there's some comics that are great at doing political humor. But in the Midwest, where a lot of the places are primarily conservative, and it's easy to lose an audience if if you're doing political humor, whether it's making fun of one side or the other. It doesn't really matter. You got to be very careful of that. So I don't know. I just try to make my material, I guess, safe is the best word, just so that if an audience comes in there, they're going to have a good time. They're going to get some laughs. They don't have to worry about getting mad about politics or being reminded.
Maybe not even safe needs to be the word. Maybe just more universally accepted, universally able to be
that's
heard.
a good way to describe it.
The family can hear it, the whole family, versus maybe something that's a little more explicit.
Yeah. And I heard a great quote. Jim Carrey was on Mark Maron's podcast not too long ago, or maybe I don't remember how long ago, but he said something that really stuck with me on there when he was talking about trying to figure out why people come to comedy shows, and that was always like his fascination, like trying to figure out why people needed that and why people needed to laugh and things like that. And he said, what I finally figured out was when people come to a comedy show, they're coming because they want to be free of concern. And that really resonated with me because, yes, when people go for that hour and a half, they want to forget about everything outside. They want to forget about their life. They want to forget about the job that they may or may not like. They want to forget about that relationship that might not be going well, or, all these bills that they might be behind, or whatever their situation is. And, as a performer, a lot of times we don't think about this, but every person that's in an audience has a different situation. We don't know what it is. So you do have to try to be conscious of that these are strangers. You don't know what they're going through. But what you do know is that they paid to come sit here for an hour and a half, forget about everything, and just laugh. And as a performer, I feel like it's my job to make sure that happens, at least to my best abilities. Now, that doesn't always happen. There are plenty of times when you bomb as a performer.
Right. Even that, though, is worth the ride, right? Because they're able to see the work take place in person, real time. And I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it shows, it also shows that you're human and that you're going to make mistakes and not be as good every time. Because that definitely, because really I think that's what comedy is about too. It's about connecting on a human level. I mean, that's a lot of the material that I try to write, and that's another thing I learned over the years. You want to be likable, but you also want to be able to connect to an audience, and that's why talking about subjects that are relatable to the audience, or that the audience can relate to, they're going to be more adept to laugh and have a good time with, because they're going to be like, oh, that's me. I'm that married guy that argues with my wife, or, I'm the wife that gets mad at my husband all the time, whatever it might be. And some people may look at it as, oh, this is, there's no real such thing. I don't feel like there's a such thing as original ideas. There's just different perspectives. Like with comedy, anything you can think of has been done as far as material goes, but it's about putting a different perspective on it. But that's why talking about, your family, everybody has a dad, and they might have a dad that's crazy, or they know somebody that's like this person, or, whatever it may be. So trying to keep the material relatable to the audience, because now they're going to be, it's going to be a way to connect, and then they're going to get vested in the show.
I understand. That's where the magic takes place, right? Where the relatability versus where they can't, versus maybe making jokes about something where only you exclusively might know. Like I remember hearing that maybe before, sometimes comedians, a mistake they can make is talking about being on the road or traveling on an airplane often and being at an airport, whereas lots of people don't do that. So you sort of have to change that up and talk about relatable things.
Oh, absolutely. And that's to your point there. I see this happen quite a bit at comedy shows where you get these comics that live in LA and they'll come to shows in the Midwest, and they'll start talking about living in LA, and it's like the people in the audience don't care because they're not in LA.
they they don't deal with actors and people in entertainment every day, so it's totally not related.
Oh, that's got to be bad, man, when that takes place. But everybody learns for themselves. You got to
No,
change it up.
absolutely. That's one of the beautiful things about comedy is it's a journey, and every comedian's on their own journey, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. We all have our own path to our own success. So you don't have to follow somebody else and do exactly what they did. And maybe you do follow somebody that's more successful and you don't get that success because you're not, like I said, everybody has their own path. So
Absolutely. And we all have to remind that there's no cookie cutter approach to it. Granted, we're always going to look up to people that sort of have things that we might have related to and we took a liking to years before. But at the end of the day, you got to take your own path and take that road and just figure it out, right? Because it's your road. It's always going to be different for everybody.
that's right. And when you fall down, you got to get back up and keep moving. I mean, that's something kind of to lead into. You mentioned earlier about that I have a podcast, and my podcast is, primarily comedy, but it's about failure. It's the art of bombing, and that's what we talk about is bombing on stage and learning from our mistakes, because that's something that I found not just in comedy, but just in life in general, that in order to find any success in anything, you need failure. Failure is it's a important part of the equation of success. And you need to be able to look back, at your failure, analyze it objectively to figure out what happened and how you can learn from it to the next time, not let that happen, or improve whatever aspect of the situation failed. And so, that's
you talk about tools on how to approach failure and how to look at it objectively, because you know how some people can't even tune into certain memories of maybe the past or mistakes they made, because the second that switches on, it's like, can't think about it, can't even, you know what I mean? How are you offering tools? Are you just talking about them? Go ahead.
The nice thing with the podcast is that I'm not necessarily offering tools for that, but what's happening is these guests they're basically giving their insight on how they looked at bombing or how they look at failure. And then we talk about what they do to try to improve, like how they look like when they have a set or, a show that they felt like they bombed. I talk to them about what did they do to try to figure out what happened? What are your techniques? What are your methods? What are you doing? And then people that are listening to can then take, oh, that's something I never thought about doing. Maybe I should try that the next time I have a bad set. When I go back and play the tape, maybe I should be looking at this, and there's
that's
different.
Awesome.
Yeah, because there's, with my podcast, I'm not just interviewing celebrity comics. I have comics that have, the range goes from comics that have only been doing comedy for, maybe less than a year to comics that have been doing it for 30 plus years that have been on the podcast. And everybody has a different perspective and a different outlook at, and different ways of doing things, like I've learned so much from so many other comics. I mean, the greatest lesson that I learned by doing that podcast is that I'm not the only comic that bombs, and bombing is part of the process. Often when I kind of started the podcast, I felt like, maybe I'm not good at comedy. Maybe I shouldn't be doing it because you have a bad set, bomb or whatever. Well, from the podcast, I've learned that if I was having great sets every time, that I probably wasn't doing comedy right because there was no failure there. Yep. Or I was failing and just couldn't look at it objectively.
And by the way, that scenario, right. Absolutely. And I think we could both agree that that's almost impossible to think that you can do the same thing every time to a room and you're always going to get the same response,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have jokes that, I have a particular joke that does good like 99% of the time, but there's 1% when that joke that I know it's a good joke because of the success rate, I will tell that joke and not get the reaction that I expected. It happens. There's just sometimes a joke's not going to work with a certain audience, and it and that's the thing, like going back to that, to the failure where,
it's going to happen. You can't account for every situation 100%. So you just have to take it as it is and try to learn from it. You know,
Adaptability.
Yeah, you got to adapt. Absolutely. That's what's really happened. You see that with comedy right now because of the pandemic. A lot of comedians had to adapt. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of things were shutting down. People were getting their gigs canceled left and right. You know, I'm not the only person that had to go through that. Lots of entertainers do. Even people with regular jobs had to go without work, and everybody's, suffered from this. But one thing with comedy, a lot of comedians either sat out for this last year and haven't really been doing anything, or they adapted. And by that, I mean, they went out and they upgraded their equipment and they started doing these virtual shows. They started putting out other content, whether they may have, started a new podcast or, started doing TikTok videos or whatever it might have been. They started to adapt. They're like, well, I can't do live comedy. So I got to do something. And so they started exploring some of these other creative outlets.
Absolutely. And there's a lot to say, I think, about just being able to look at maybe taking some of the time off for the pandemic that some people had to take, or some of these big blasts, even that you said you took. You said you had a lot of momentum before this thing took place. You had a lot of things taking place, a lot of action, and then boom. And then it's like, you can't really think of that as failure, but rather adapt. And no matter how much time, maybe, I hear a lot of comedians, the comedy club here in Hollywood was a grand mecca. It was a machine that was always operating, and then now it's like the comedy store. Yeah. Yep. And then now it's like a ghost town, from what I hear. And I haven't even been around there recently, but where are those people at? Maybe they had to take some time off, but at the end of the day, we want to see whatever people have been cooking and working on to just come out and to see it come into fruition, right? We don't want to see people just kind of, this is a very test of time right now, right? Test of character for a lot of people. And like you said, here we are, we had to adapt. A lot of us jumped on the web and said, hey, let's start a show. Let's do some TikTok. Let's do something. I think Brian Callen just put out his newest special like a couple of days ago on YouTube, so. Yeah.
And that's another thing you're really seeing. At least from my perspective, being in comedy, I see this a lot. A lot of great comics are doing that now. Instead of like releasing through like Comedy Central or Netflix or HBO or whatever, they're just doing it themselves. They're going out, filming them, and then putting them on YouTube. Mm-hmm. They're having good success doing that.
Hey, that's good, because that we never used to see. It was always HBO and Showtime, and now it's like YouTube, and it's awesome to see that basically you can do it on your own. That basically says that anybody can do it on their own. Put out a great special and everybody's going to be able to watch it.
Mm-hmm. And with YouTube, I mean, it used to be just putting out little clips, that's all you could do or whatever. And to their credit, constantly kind of working on their platform and expanding it so people could put out longer videos. I think in the long run that worked out for YouTube, because now, like I said, you got all these comedians putting out 1 hour specials on YouTube and they're getting lots of views, which means if they're getting lots of views, people are seeing all their ads, and that's definitely generating money for YouTube.
Hey, absolutely right. I mean, they're definitely working for it. I think it goes vice versa in many ways, right? But YouTube definitely has the supercharger operating right now, because a lot of people, I wonder if they have the number for how many people created a YouTube account during the pandemic, just out of ransom, or maybe
before and after. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, just in podcasts, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I know a lot more podcasts popped up after the pandemic started than there was. I mean, and there already was a bunch of podcasts post-pandemic or pre-pandemic, but
yeah. And you know what? The Rogan left to Spotify, and then that sort of opened up the room for maybe lots of people who were watching that podcast primarily on YouTube, kind of opened up opportunity for all these other smaller shows. Because you're right, I see lots of new shows every day. It seems like pop up every day. It's a new comedian, and sometimes it's people that It's like, oh, this guy has a show with this guy, and then everybody's just sort of collaborating and just starting shows, and it's pretty awesome. But then it's pretty cool to see people like Bill Burr say that he got better as a comedian from having a podcast and just pretty much talking to himself, because sometimes you wonder if putting out too much of your work, too much of your material out there, you you drop the value of it, right? It sort of starts to lose its value, but It doesn't seem to be the case. People seem to just love consuming hours and hours of Dan talking about whatever it is, failure and how to bounce back from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And and that's good. I mean, if people are consuming the stuff that, that we put out as creators, you know, that's what we want, Otherwise it's like, why are we doing it? I mean, and for me, my podcast is very niche, and I know that I have I don't have like a huge audience, but and that's because it's niche, my podcast, pretty much my primary audience is either, I describe it as a hardcore comedy nerd or new comics. That's primarily who's listening to my podcast. And I'm cool with that. And as long as I have a few listeners and people are getting something from the podcast, I'm doing my job. But I don't do it, I do it for that, but I do it because I'm learning from it. Every time I sit down with a new comedian and hear their story of the time that they bombed really bad, and all their takeaways and stuff, I'm getting all this information. And just doing the podcast over the last 4 years, that's made me better as a comedian. Not because I'm talking to myself, but because I'm learning from all these other people. It's like
Naturally.
every week is a new lesson. There's always, while there's been things that come up frequently, because, in comedy, you always have hecklers and you have, these situations that come up often. Those pop up on the podcast, but there's always something a little different from each comic. And so you get that information.
And just that sense of community must be so awesome to be like, hey, you know what? I've dealt with the same thing. How did you deal with that? We're all dealing with the same sort of obstacles, and it's so awesome to talk about it and just to get into it. I think that's really awesome that you can just chop it up with these characters about this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, and a lot of it, that's part of why I wanted to do it. I mean, when I decided to create my podcast, I mean, I'd had podcasts prior to that. It wasn't like the first podcast I ever did, but I wanted to do a comedy podcast, but I wanted it to be different because to me, it seemed like most of the comedy podcasts out there were very similar. It was usually one comic interviewing another comic, or, maybe getting some info about stand up, but most of it was interview style, and they just seemed kind of the same. And one thing I noticed is that nobody was talking about bombing on stage. Like, it wasn't a perspective people wanted to talk about, and I wanted to do something different, and I'm glad that I did, because by doing it, the greatest thing that I took away from it is that I learned that I'm not the only one doing it. That, like I said, it's part of the process. And in that community, like you said, it was good to be able to talk to people, because as a performer, and especially as a comedian, bombing is not an easy thing. Like, it's already not an easy thing to do, to walk into a room full of strangers and try to make them laugh. I mean, that is a very scary thing, full of anxiety. People with stage fright even have a harder time doing it. I mean, there's people that do it. And so you have all these things going on, and it's so scary. And then when you go up there and you have to do your time and you're not getting anything, like, it just destroys you inside, mentally and emotionally. And then, of course, that can lead to depression, which then can, lead to mental health issues, which then can lead to physical ailments and things like that. So, like, it's the whole downward spiral of things. But being able to talk about it, you get it out there, and it doesn't have that same effect on you anymore.
It keeps that snowball from getting larger, right? It just keeps that snowball effect from taking place. It kind of like places a stop and says, hold on, let's talk about it. That's so funny. That's so funny you dealt with that. So did I. That's like, can't wait for the next one. It's almost like you get excited for the next one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing that's been kind of funny about it with comedy. Like, when you're bombing, it sucks, but then a lot of times some of the greatest stories in comedy that I've learned or that I've heard were because it was a bombing situation. Some of the stories are just great, and they're very entertaining, and it's easy to laugh at them now because it's in the past.
Right. Hey, that's awesome. And that's how you gotta be able to laugh at it and just look at it that way. Exactly. Just laugh at it.
Laugh it off, and kind of going back, talking about adapting. You mentioned being in Hollywood in the Comedy Store. I just saw that they've been doing drive-in shows out at the Rose Bowl, the Comedy Store. So while they're not doing it indoors because of all the restrictions in California, a lot of people started doing comedy outdoors, which pre-pandemic, outdoor comedy was not a favorite of anybody. Nobody wanted to do comedy. If there was a show that you're being booked on and you knew it was outside, you're like, oh, great. This is going to be one of them bombing stories.
Right.
This is going to be horrible. But now, drive-in shows have popped up all over. They've been doing them all over. People have been doing backyard shows, and all kinds of outdoor comedy has stemmed from this, because of the adapting. And I don't think it's going to go away now. Now people are like, oh, doing an outside show is fun. And I've seen comics have did comedy specials on rooftops and in backyards that are out there now. And I think that's great.
A lot of it is very run and gun, right? It seems like just a couple of mics and a bar stool outside, some chairs, fold out chairs, and get to it.
It's very indie, very DIY, which I've always been a big fan of the do it yourself.
Hey, but that adds another element of difficulty, I feel like, because a lot of people can sort of hide behind the ambiance, right? And then when you're outdoors and you got a stool and people sitting on fold out chairs in the sun, you got to be able to really have some good material, or you're gonna bomb.
Oh yeah. Easy to lose them with all those distractions.
Yeah, but we love a good test. We love a good test, and this is exactly what this.
But the thing is it's becoming, at the beginning it was probably awkward for people and audiences and stuff, but now it's kind of becoming a normal thing. The more that you do it outside and do these shows like this, the more normalized it becomes, and then it's not as hard as it was when it first started.
Right. Hey, this is life, right? We're moving forward.
Got to move forward every day. You can't. If you fall, you got to get up and keep going.
Got to get up. All right, Dan. Well, hey, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And how can we find you on social media?
All right. Well, I got a website. You can find me, danbublitz.com. Otherwise, on social media, I am on all platforms as D Bublitz Comedy, and that is spelled Bublitz, the last name. And then the Art of Bombing Pod can be found anywhere you get your podcasts, all the major podcast players, or you can go to the website artofbombingpod.com, and it is on all social medias as Art of Bombing Pod.
Very nice. All right. And like I said before, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear your story and hear just your process. It's real inspiring. It's really awesome to get to speak with you. And let's get you back on again. Hopefully we can speak about some things you've brought into fruition.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, Dan. I really appreciate it.